Good morning. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we meet and we learn from each other today on country. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land, where I live, work and write, and I pay my sincere respects to elders past, present and emerging. For those of you joining us today who don't know me, my name is Rachel Franks and I'm the Coordinator of Scholarship at the State Library of New South Wales. And that means I get to look after the library's fellows. And today is quite a special scholar talk. I know I often say that, but today we actually get to present the work of our inaugural Dr. A.M. Hertzberg AO Fellow. Now, this fellowship was commenced only a few years ago now to celebrate innovation in industry in the library's collections. And the library is very grateful to the Hertzberg family for funding more stories to come out of our collections. The inaugural fellow for this particular opportunity was Dr. Elizabeth Humphreys, and she's a political economist at the University of Technology, Sydney, and she explores the world of work and workers, and particularly at points of change and crisis, whether that's economic crisis, neoliberalism, climate change, or workplace disasters. So today, Elizabeth is going to be presenting on some of her research. It's been wonderful to have her as a fellow, as it is always wonderful to host all of our fellows, especially over the last few years where some people have done an extraordinary amount of work and then their presentations like today have been delayed because of the pandemic. So even though it has been a really difficult time for lots of people, it's been great that the library has been able to continue supporting all of our fellows. And I'm grateful that Elizabeth is here today. If you have any questions for her about her research or her presentation this morning, please use the chat feature on Zoom and I'll be back in a little bit to ask your questions. Thanks so much.
Hi everyone, and thanks Rachel. I'm speaking with you today from Gadigal lands of the Eora Nation as well, land that always was and always will never be ceded Gadigal lands. The working class people, the state of the economy and the relative power of the labour movement directly relate to their standard of living. While the professional classes often have savings to fall back on or accumulated wealth passed on from previous generations, recessions come at a great cost to blue-collar workers and their families. At the same time, the gap between rich and poor is significant in Australia and growing. As the Australian Council of Trade Unions notes, income inequality is greater than at any time in the last 70 years. Half of Australians do not think they will have enough income to retire on, and living standards have declined and job security has diminished. A major survey a few years ago found that while most Australians know there is a significant disparity between the best off and worst off, they also grossly underestimate the extent of this. My research investigates the world of work, especially how workers adapt to crisis and change. I have a long-term interest in Australia's metal and engineering unions, who have historically played one of the most important roles in industrial relations in Australia. It was the Metal Workers Award that set the pace for all wages through our unique industrial system for much of last century. And when those workers won gains on the shop floor, it flowed on to others, importantly, to workers on lower wages and in less well-organised industries. My research at the State Library of Victoria was focused on the impact of the 1970s economic crisis on the lives of metal workers. Of course, when we talk about workers and economic change, we are also often talking about those who lose their jobs, those who lose good jobs in conditions for poorer roles, and those who don't have enough work or hours to get by. But workers are not passive in the face of economic change, which itself is not a neutral or natural thing. What policies are implemented by governments to address unemployment, what mitigating action is taken by employers, and what workers do is always contingent and political. Decent wages and conditions have and must be fought for, often over many generations. While history is often told as one about great and famous men and women, it is ordinary men and women and their labour unions who organise those struggles. My talk today focuses on the economic crises of the 1970s and 1980s, but I'm going to touch on the crises of other economic periods as I draw links between these generations and the struggles of one, and not just for themselves, but for the broader goal of improving working and living conditions for the majority in Australia. Our story starts in the Illawarra, a part of our state traditionally dominated by coal mining, farming, and steel production. It is a story of two people who will never meet, but they attend the same demonstration in Sydney in late 1982 in the middle of a severe economic downturn. In Wollongong in October 1982, during an economic crisis that was already a decade long, a meeting of 20,000 workers in the Steel City voted to organise a protest march to Sydney. They were angry about government inaction over rising unemployment, mass sackings and economic suffering. They were also demanding the right to work. This mass meeting had come on the back of strike actions and fights against the retrenchment of workers, including a 16-day occupation by Keyera miners, Kamina miners, against their impending sacking. By the end of October, 40 people had set off on a week-long march to the state capital. As one marcher, Nick Southall, described, they were mainly young and mostly unemployed, including young and unemployed steelworkers who had just lost their jobs in the mass sackings. It included members of YAPO, an acronym for a loosely organised group called Young and Pissed Off, members of the local unemployed people's movement, the Sydney Unemployed People's Union, union delegates and organisers, and others employed and unemployed. These marches and the labour movement in general wanted to highlight that there were still clear winners and losers in the economic crisis. In Steel City Blues, which explored the crisis of this era, Juliana Schultz wrote that her book explored what happens in a region when the economic foundations that underpinned its growth imploded, what it meant for people, for business, for local government, and for the political system. In the words of the subtitle to her book, she documented the human cost of industrial crisis. As Schultz described, the steel and coal mining industries had been Wollongong's raison d'etre, and they were caught in a pincer movement of collapsing global trade and rapid technological change on one side, and the consequences of underinvestment, old-fashioned and counterproductive methods of industrial relations and community relations, and a lack of economic or industry policy clarity from Canberra. Schultz here underlines something I said earlier, that economic crisis is not a natural phenomenon, and choices are made regarding what to do, who to protect, or in deciding to do nothing. On the week-long march to Sydney, the right to workers who were demanding the right to a job were supported and welcomed along the way, including by unions, workers, retired union members, pensioners, people in cars and trucks honking their horns, and residents calling out support from their homes and gardens as they walked by. By the end of the slog, a distance that far had left many bleeding and bandaged, but it also pushed their concerns onto the front pages of major newspapers. When the Wollongong Right to Work marchers arrived at Belmore Park in Sydney, opposite Central Station, they were welcomed by thousands of supporters. After initial speeches, the rally made its way through the streets and brought the city to a standstill in peak hour. The demonstration weaved past the corporate headquarters of BHP, a key employer in Wollongong, and then on to New South Wales Parliament House. At its peak, the rally swelled to 20,000 demonstrators. A group of singers sang a song written by the marchers on their journey to the tune of Click Goes the Shears, and the first verse went like this, not that I'm going to sing it. Down in the gong, we're all on the dole. We're looking for jobs is like climbing a greasy pole. The bosses in Mercedes, they tell us times are slack, but they keep making profits and we just get the sack. Nick Southall, then a young and employed activist in the early 1980s, was one of those who completed the 90-kilometre trek. While later in life he would become an academic and a leading scholar of struggles in Wollongong around unemployment in this period. At that time, he was a young activist working with others to highlight the harsh realities of living and working or not working, in the case of many, in the Illawarra. Southall recalls that on that day they arrived in Sydney, workers from construction sites had walked off the job to join the march, others left metal and engineering shops, and mail workers stopped work. People coming from across the city and a wide range of industries. Among those that came to meet the Wollongong contingent were workers from the Garden Island dockyards, a militant metal and engineering manufacturing worksite. The contingent included seasoned unionist Bert Heinemann, by then approaching retirement. Heinemann was a highly skilled metal worker and a staunch Communist Party of Australia member. He was also an avid photographer with the proficiency to build his own photographic equipment. We know Bert was there from the photos he took before and at the demonstration of his fellow workers that day, which are held in the State Library collection. Although Southall recalls that the Garden Island workers were at the Sydney demonstration, he doesn't remember meeting Heinemann specifically, although he says he's terrible with names, so he may well have. Yet Southall and Heinemann meet in a different way in my research, as two activists of two different generations participating in and documenting working class struggle and politics. Heinemann was a Garden Island shop steward, secretary of the Granville local branch of the Engineering and Metals Union. He was active in the state branch of the union and received the union's Merit Award in 1984, not long after this demonstration. The New South Wales Library holds many of Heinemann's photographs and slides that document both his personal and political life. Amongst these are the photos from political demonstrations over many decades, as well as many he took for the CPA newspaper, The Tribune. In Heinemann's photo used to publicise today's talk, we see Garden Island workers walking to the stock exchange to protest the sacking of the Whitlam government. He took photos of workers at work, on protests, at social gatherings, and in one, he and his fellow workers dressed in their Sunday best. Heinemann was a member of the Communist Party for 49 years. The CPA, which began as a socialist organisation inspired by the Russian Revolution, had remained small and had little electoral success, but was far the largest political formation to the left of the ALP and was influential in trade unions and social movements. The Communist Party of Australia was traditionally closer to the mainstream than similar parties overseas, and by the 1960s it was criticising the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, and by the 70s really saw a strategy for socialism as one where the state would be transformed from the inside rather than by revolution. But its goal remained to abolish class division, exploitation, and human oppression. Bert Heinemann only had 3 years of high school, but he argued that understanding politics in the world was essential for working people. He said that for young people entering work, the job of understanding the total workings of our societies is of utmost importance, and this continues throughout one's life. When Heinemann first began his apprenticeship as a teen in 1938, it was at the end of the Great Depression and on the eve of World War II. He encountered workers that had lived and had been active through the wave of industrial struggles in the 1890s. These struggles, often called the Great Strikes, had been the first mass union struggles in the southern colonies of what would later become Australia. There had been strikes and worker action before, but nothing like this. Beginning with the Great Maritime Strike of seamen, wharf labourers and marine officers, the conflict spread to miners, shearers and transport workers. Scholar Ray Markey notes that this explosion was a result of economic and social concerns, growing class consciousness, as well as the deeper organisation of both unions and employers. The power of employers at this time was not to be trifled with, and workers were getting more organised as well. As the chair of the Steamship Owners Association put it in July 1890, all the owners throughout Australia have signed a bond to stand by one another. I believe that never before has such an opportunity to test the relative strength of labour and capital arisen. The Great Strikes ended, unfortunately, in defeat and were confronted by an economic depression and mass unemployment in the early 1890s, with the unions almost wiped out. Recession and the formidable forces of employers combining to crush hopes of better wages and conditions. But it was in these stories from these old workers who were now approaching their retirement in the late 1930s, just as unions were really starting to rebuild in Australia, that a young Heinemann would first learn about working class politics and start his labour movement education. He said of starting his apprenticeship in 1938 as a fitter and turner in Zetland, that he got to understand what made the world go round, and early. Learning about the experience of these workers for Heinemann and the next generation of activists around him would be of importance in future moments of crisis and change, most particularly in the 1970s, when again the struggles of working class people, led by blue-collar workers, would need to confront employers and government to protect working conditions during a period of economic crisis. During the long boom following the Second World War, from 1945 to 1972, workers' confidence was boosted by steadily increasing affluence and close to full employment. Although it's important to note that full employment of this era was gendered and racialised, with women and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders as excluded in particular. The prosperity of the late 1960s, a new generation of union militants had emerged. And between 1967 and 1969, the number of strike days in Australia doubled. Laurie Ahrens, then Secretary of the Communist Party of Australia, stated that the time had come for a determined militant confrontation with the employer arbitration government class structure. On the front foot, the CPA won several key union elections in the period that followed, and Australia's most intense period of industrial militancy commenced, with the Metal Workers Union playing the leading role. The success of the union movement in the 70s included an increased wages share of national income, or GDP, which rose from under 55% in the late 60s to over 62% by early 1975. But this rising movement encountered the global oil shocks, and the economic malaise was deep and intractable in countries like Australia. What many refer to as the golden age, the long post-war boom, ended abruptly with a widespread crisis of profitability, as it did in other advanced capitalist countries. These were tough times. The 70s and early 80s had delivered 5 official recessions, and the post-World War II economic boom had long faded. In the manufacturing, metal and steel industries, thousands of jobs were being shed across the country. Each time a small recovery occurred, these sectors did not hire back the number of workers lost in the period prior. Rising unemployment and inflation had hit hard, and by the 1980s, the real value of wages was falling. Consecutive Commonwealth governments unsuccessfully tackled the situation. During those years, the cornerstone of the Australian welfare system, the centrally indexed full-time wage and its associated conditions, came under increasing pressure from concurrently rising inflation and unemployment. Sections of the labour movement sought to preserve wages and conditions through workplace-based struggle, and industrial militancy reached its highest point in the nation's history, with peaks in the mid-1970s and again in the early 1980s. And although a resources-led boom at the end of the 1970s gave brief respite to the recessionary tendencies, the Australian economy contracted again in 1981. There was widespread hardship in working class suburbs, rural areas, and in industrial cities like Wollongong and Newcastle. Australian manufacturing suffered the brunt of the economic collapse. For example, the recession in 1981 destroyed 80,000 jobs in metals manufacturing, but the upturn later in 1981 and into 1982 restored only 35,000 of them, less than half. This had a dramatic impact on the working class, shifting the leading and militant metal workers and other CPA-aligned unions to move away from a militant strike strategy, often called hot shops, and to back a national accord with the Labor Party. This was a significant change at the height of union power in the 1970s and was for several reasons, including rising unemployment and mass sackings that undermined the confidence of the union leadership that it could fight at the rank and file level and win. The union was also changing politically, and it increasingly supported improving efficiency of manufacturing and business competitiveness, and the belief that it would ensure growth and protect or expand employment for members. And finally, the growing number of unemployed workers, both inside and outside the ranks of the Metals Union, drove concern about the inadequacies of welfare state provisions in a high inflation environment. Thus, the social wage, meaning the terribly low level of unemployment benefits, Medicare and superannuation, had increasing importance in a period of high unemployment. Several AMW publications in the late 1970s and early 80s, including The People's Budget and Australia Ripped Off, attempted to elaborate an alternative economic strategy to plot a path forward other than the Fraser government's wage freeze and austerity. These publications provided workers with detailed facts on the state of the economy, emphasising the impact of crisis and government policy on working people. And they encouraged members to talk about Australia's political economy with other workers and their family. They highlighted how business was continuing to make significant profits during the crisis and criticised increasing attacks on labour organisers. Out of this economic malaise and the pain in working class communities, there was hope in the lead up of the election of the Hawke government in 1983. Wanting to set aside the confrontational approach of the previous decade, the ALP and leading unions developed an accord statement on prices and incomes. The unions viewed the social contract as a way to maintain the living standards of their members, given the strategy of industrial militancy in the 70s and early 80s was at a point of exhaustion. In return for Labor agreeing to moderate wage claims to the level of inflation, the social contract promised to restrain prices, introduce economic and taxation reform, and extend the social wage. The accord was reconstituted through national wage cases and renegotiated terms over 13 years and eight editions. The original statement set out a wide-ranging economic and social policy. However, it is generally acknowledged that the process quickly focused and narrowed to be almost exclusively about wages. Real wage levels, which were to be maintained under the accord, declined markedly. Early in the period, the ALP adopted a policy, the Trilogy, a commitment not to increase taxation, government expenditure, or the size of the budget deficit as a percentage of GDP. What this meant in practice was a significantly curtailed social wage spending. Many core elements of the original accord statement were not implemented, and on occasion, policy contrary to the text was adopted. Australia's tariff system was dismantled and free education was abolished in contravention of the agreement. Taxation, which was to be restructured under the accord to ensure business paid a fair share, moved in the opposite direction. The period of the accord also involved the advance of vanguard neoliberalism, or what we called in Australia economic rationalism. Two of the most successful industry plans to restructure the economy in this period rationalised the foreign-owned car and steel industry, shedding tens of thousands of jobs. For example, in the case of the steel plan in Wollongong, as we have discussed, the focal point for union militancy in response to the serious effects of unemployment during the crisis, the government and the ACTU, in Nick Southall's words, accepted BHP's long-term strategy and supported the provision of hundreds of millions of taxpayers' dollars to the company to invest in job-displacing technology. The industry plan for steel was intended to restructure the industry in accordance with the wishes of the major employer. Thus, as Julianne Schultz argues, when Hawke spoke of saving the steel industry, it was a salvation of the balance sheet he was talking about, a balance sheet that made no provision for the social impact of restructuring. Although unions fought the plan, they were ultimately brought into line by the national union leadership and the threat of mass sackings in a town already ravaged by unemployment. Industry policy was, in practice, a process that placed unions inside the state's efforts to restructure the economy in the interests of capital. Even though the AMWU backed the Accord as a solution to the crisis and as a way to rebuild a manufacturing sector ravaged by economic and technological change, there was dissent amongst officials and rank and file union members. Ted Ganetenko, a former General Motors holder and shop steward and education officer with the AMWU, argued that the union's method of dealing with the Hawke government resulted in alienating a large slice of the working population, and that considerable erosion of their living standards without concerted action to defend them. The role of the Metal Workers Union in the Accord process demonstrates how the Accord incorporated a militant union into a new political project at the hands of Hawke and Keating, centred on reviving profits and modernising the Australian economy. Central to what we now call neoliberal restructuring was the participation of unions in industry structural adjustments and efforts to increase productivity. While the metal unions may have gone into the Accord with good intentions, the agreement between the ACTU and the Hawke-Keating governments resulted in significant real wage suppression. In the 1980s, the AMWU was the largest and most powerful union in Australia. It was the leading edge of industrial struggle, and its fight for a social contract was key to ensuring the establishment and implementation of the Accord. Without the sanction and ongoing support of the metals union leadership in the Accord era, the social contract could have not been cohered. The shift in the AMWU's approach from a strategy of rank and file mobilisation to a central corporatist agreement was pivotal. Of course, in this period and into the 90s is when we saw significant decline in union membership in Australia from over 50% when the Accord agreement was commenced in 1983 to now sitting in the early teens. My research is more than academic curiosity. It is about better understanding the impact of the 1970s and 1980s crises because I lived through them. I grew up in a working class family in the outer suburbs of Melbourne. When my father was made redundant by Mobil in the early 1990s, in the wake of 1991 recession, after years of service to the company where he worked long hours and sacrificed time with our family, I remember him saying to me that in the end, you are only a number to the boss. I feel that many workers who lose their jobs understand this, and workers who lose good jobs with decent conditions later in life often do not find work again. And if they do, it is usually more precarious and for less money. This will be the experience of the 250 current workers at that same Mobil refinery when it shuts down soon, an announcement made only earlier this year. We are now living through a new period of economic contraction and crisis. In 2020, COVID-19 delivered Australia its first official recession in 30 years. Work and not being able to work is again at the centre of our national experience. Restrictions on people and businesses saw paid work vanish for some. And while many white-collar jobs were easily able to transition to remote work, this was not possible for others. Further, the work done by some of our essential but lowest paid workers, such as hospital orderlies, security officers, cleaners, and food delivery workers, is increasingly visible in the community at this time. For many of these workers, however, the workplace involved a new set of challenges brought on by COVID-19. There was more work than could reasonably be done, longer hours for many, an increased intensity on the job, often fewer staff, and a lack of suitable personal protective equipment and safety protocols in place. The pandemic revealed sharply the underlying structures of inequality across and within workplaces in Australia. We had to think who was at most risk of contracting the virus, who had access to high quality healthcare if they did, who could socially distance and who could not. We had to think about who was financially at risk in this new economic downturn and whether the usual level of unemployment benefits could keep people out of severe poverty. The short answer is no. The growth of precarious or non-permanent work in which people do not have access to paid sick leave was revealed as not just an individual problem, but a social one. Many of these workers find themselves torn between staying home when they had symptoms to protect colleagues and the broader community and putting food on the table. While Australia is not technically in recession at the moment and jobs are being created, many of these are less secure than the jobs that previously existed. Many people have given up looking for work because there is none they can do, and these discouraged workers, as they are called, are not recorded in our official statistics, despite wanting the right to work or the right to more work. A significant number of part-time and casual workers also have fewer hours than they need, what we often call the underemployed. They're not counted and their financial difficulties are made somewhat invisible in the official rate. Alongside this, government payments are simply unlivable and recipients regularly go without meals. Unemployment benefits are just under $44 a day, which anywhere in the country really is unlivable. While the causes of the 1970 and 1980s crisis and the COVID-19 recession were quite different, both are reminders that tough economic times are not experienced equally. Work and the lack thereof are key to wealth, poverty, and living standards. They affect educational and health outcomes, and an economic crisis is born more acutely in working class communities. The unemployment rate in Wollongong in the December quarter of 2020 was about 77%, almost 2% higher than the New South Wales rate overall, and youth unemployment is significantly higher than that. In the midst of this, and almost 40 years after the Right to Work March, a new generation of young unemployed people has been organising. With 170 unemployed and employed members across the region, but led by unemployed workers, they've been providing advocacy and mutual aid. Dean Fletcher, the Australian Unemployed Workers Union Wollongong Illawarra branch coordinator, said that the activists draw on the radical history of Wollongong that Nick Southall and others participated in and their struggles around unemployment. Dean says that for him, the most inspiring thing about the Wollongong Out of Workers group was their mutual aid programs through the kitchens they had set up, the rooms they had for people to sleep in, and the other services like their advocacy and outreach work for people on the dole. That model of providing free help for anyone who needs it has been the base for their work and what they have been trying to do today, trying to work towards the same levels of assistance that they were able to provide in the early 1980s. I'm always stunned by these young activists who are living in exceptionally difficult circumstances and with the stress that poverty and a lack of income brings, yet still so focused on camaraderie and assisting others. During the panic, I stumbled into a Zoom meeting where this new generation of unemployed activists were discussing the research done by Nick Southall, drawing on the legacy and him of others in the same decade 4 decades earlier. From the great strikes in the 1890s until now, working and unemployed people have fought battles to protect and expand remuneration and conditions of blue-collar workers, their families, and their communities. I conducted most of the research for my fellowship just prior to the pandemic. In 2019, I sat every Monday in the Mitchell Reading Room Special Collections desk under that grand ceiling, researching the lives of metalworkers and the unemployed during the 1970s and 1980s. I also travelled to Canberra, to the Noel Butlin Archive at ANU, which houses the biggest collection of union and business materials in the country. I had spreadsheets of books and materials to request, and I searched through innumerable boxes. There were posters, photos, pamphlets, government reports, newspapers, badges, minutes books, certificates of union participation, and much more. You can't imagine how little time a year is, though, to map the shape of what life was like in the middle of that 1970s crisis for blue-collar workers. But despite all these materials, they often provided limited insight into how the changes in this period impact workers' lives beyond the official record. The library is dependent on what materials people create, keep, and donate. The letters and diaries of historical or literary figures are more likely to be the treasures you find, whereas written documents from ordinary workers, even those heavily involved in social and political struggle, are rarer. This is not unusual, and historians have noted the absence of the voices of working class people about many libraries and archives internationally. There were moments in my research where strands came together, such as when Southall and Heinemann's paths and stories crossed in that moment in Belmore Park, and I could better see the contours of the lives of blue-collar workers during that long 1970s economic downturn. And of course, the New South Wales State Library holds an impressive collection of materials related to the Communist Party of Australia. What we document as our history is, of course, contested and always political. It's important to think of how we can extend the library's materials to carry different and more diverse voices about this period. With this in mind, and after the small interruption of a global pandemic, the second phase of my research will proceed later this year. An oral history project to collect more of the stories of metals and manufacturing workers and the unemployed in this period. The exciting thing for me in collecting these oral histories is that these stories will be in the workers' own words. In finishing, I'd like to thank the staff of the State Library for their support and guidance in my research, especially Rachel Franks, Maria Savitas, and the staff in the Special Collections area. Nick Southall's research and personal recollections have been essential to my understanding of the social struggles in Wollongong in that area. I'd like to thank him and to thank Peter Murphy. Peter was a member of the Communist Party of Australia and has made several deposits of materials to the library, including putting together the Bert Heinemann collection. He was also generous in sharing his personal recollections of Bert with me for this research. It would be great to hear any questions you might have, and thank you for coming today.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. It's a fairly devastating account of what people have fought hard for and what people have lost. We do have a couple of questions coming through. The first is, I'm so excited to hear that you're doing some oral histories. And how many oral histories do you think you might be able to do to add on this topic to the library's collection? And I know that you're ambitious, but...
How long is a piece of string? I think it's been difficult, obviously, because the workers we are talking about are in their 70s and 80s. And I also am high risk with the pandemic. And so it's really, even though we've had some greater freedoms at points, until there's mass vaccination, it's really held things up. My goal is 10 to start with, and then I think we take it from there. But I'm particularly going to look for metals manufacturing workers who weren't members of the Communist Party of Australia, because that is one rich source in the library, and also to look at workers from more diverse cultural backgrounds and ethnic backgrounds, because obviously that particular part of Australia's industries had a really large participation from migrants who were heavily involved in organising themselves, even if that what they did hasn't been necessarily well documented, or materials might still be held by those communities. So I think digging into that and taking a few of the little leads that I have found in the library's collection to pursue that. But of course, it's always dependent on people wanting to do an oral history. And so we've set up a structure where people can do interviews to feed into the research and not have it deposited with the library, but they'll contribute to knowledge generally, and others who'd be happy to have their oral history donated to the library and released when they choose, whether that's available now or after they pass.
This question might be a little bit trickier. So someone's picked up on a thought that I had when you were talking about the statistics and the rate of union membership. And I was, perhaps quite naively, really shocked to see how membership had fallen. This person is asking about how everyday Australians can keep the government in check so that economic policies help decrease the wealth gap between the rich and poor. Can we rely on the government for positive change for everyone in society?
Just a small question. I think
it's really important though, isn't it?
One thing to think about is whether governments grant us change or whether governments are forced to take certain political decisions because of wider social pressures. So when unions have been strong and loud and had high membership, they've been able to have a greater say in the direction of public policy. And so I think this is true generally in terms of social struggles. The bigger the social struggle in the community, the more likely politicians and policy will be to follow. So even though union membership is disastrously low, about 13% or something like that, and this is not a unique story in Australia, it's happened in a lot of advanced capitalist countries. Unions are generally supported by a broader group than that, who back the right, I guess, of unions and the ACTU to have a say in public life. But there is no shortcut that if people want to press social press social questions and force government to take action, they need to exercise power, and that takes people. And that's not just true of that's true for employers as well. Like, they have their own organizations that press their interests and their questions. And just where you ended the question on, I think one thing I'm trying to get across is that whilst we talk about the national interest, there may not actually be one. That what is in the best interests of working people, and especially blue-collar people, may not be in the interests of wealthy people in maximising profits in their corporations or of multinationals. Sometimes there are intractable conflicts in terms of the way that national income is divided up and who gets a share of that.
The next question that's come through is possibly a little bit more of a comment, and it's looking specifically at COVID and just what sort of policies do you think we might see? I mean, I think it's impossible to predict, but the question's actually about the most effective and fair economic policies, but then is also talking about what we're most likely to see. And I think you've just highlighted that that might not actually be the same thing. So did you want to comment on what you think might be next after COVID and people start talking about repairing the budget or whatever type of language they'll use?
Well, that's the thing about language. It often is political in itself. So when we talk about repairing the budget, or we talk about efficiency in a workplace, it's quite often coded language. Efficiency is a great example. What efficiency often means is people being made to work harder, right? To do more in the same amount of time. And we're seeing that in many places, in many government and non-government private sector corporations, as staff is being cut back, but the workload continues to be the same. Or for some workers, say cleaners, I just looked at the responses to a survey from cleaners and members of the United Workers Union in relation to the impact of heat stress and whether how COVID had impacted that. And many of them talk about having to work in conditions where air conditioning in schools was not allowed to be used. And so they would have to vacuum in the height of summer in Queensland without air conditioning, COVID causing them to need to clean play equipment in the middle of the day because it now has to be cleaned multiple times rather than once. Cleaners in meatworks, which we know was a big hotspot for COVID, having to wear full PPE, including face balaclavas, and the sort of sweating and stress on the body that puts it under, but with no extra time often to do those things. So I think COVID points to the real squeeze points, particularly for workers who are less well paid and perhaps have less agency, paid sick leave, and the right remuneration and the right number of workers to do the job. They're quite simple things, but for me, that has to be next. And paid sick leave is on the agenda. The Victorian government stepped in to give paid sick leave to non-ongoing permanent staff. Even in the university sector, casual staff were given paid sick leave if they got COVID at the start. It has been possible to struggle even during COVID. Workers have won particular gains, but moving back to a system of employment where the benefits that you and I have, Rachel, of you know, a shared responsibility for being sick, right? We pay our doctor's bills and we're the ones who are sick, but our employers cover us, cover our wages in those periods. I think that that's essential, and it's really, I think, revealed some of the pretty gross inequalities in terms of employment in Australia, and particularly for younger workers who are much more likely to be in non-permanent roles, but still have to live and pay bills and put food on the table.
Somebody's asking, you've mentioned the oral histories. I know that you'll have an article soon in Open Book, the library's magazine, but are you hoping to publish this research anywhere else?
Sorry, I've been muting myself because there's a construction site next door to my place.
That's good. People are working.
Yes. Look, I think so. I need to think about what is important to publish out of this. I would like to do a bigger piece on Bert Heinemann, but you know, he's now died, and I think I'm just going to have to see over longer term what materials come up from him. I think an important piece of work to potentially publish is, and this is research I haven't even really started, is about organising amongst unemployed people in Wollongong. It's the 40th anniversary of that march, and in a few years' time, and I know that the Unemployed Workers Union there are looking to create their own materials and document their struggles around that anniversary. I think that would be very good. But I really think that, like I said, there's little snippets of the life of metal workers in the 70s crisis, but it is important, I think, to not just rely on the official records in the libraries, the government's reports, the union minutes, but actually to dig a bit more deeply. And in that sense, the oral histories are really essential before I think I'll publish academic work that sort of come out of the library's collection.
Somebody's asking a question about the Accord process of Hawke and Keating, and asking how instrumental it was in the decline of union membership.
This is a really contested question amongst scholars. So some scholars think it had a more minimal impact, and others think it had a clear but played a particular role. And some of that's done on modelling, right, of why people left. One academic calls it like the exit voice period of kind of complaint about the Accord, that people left unions and new workers didn't join. But there's also, it's a complex question because there are other factors. Restructuring of the economy led to the decline of manufacturing, which was really well unionised, and the rise of other industries like service industries, which are traditionally less well organised. And so for me, I think there is a clear, discernible impact of the Accord on union membership. But the bigger question is, because the Accord stopped industrial struggle, like the ACTU and unions agreed to not go on strike, it kind of froze the ability of workers to organise. And you can't wait 13 years and just switch that back on. You lose in that period all the knowledge that has been built up. And as I tried to show in the talk, right, this knowledge is passed on from generation to generation as workers learn from fellow workers and previous generations of struggle, what worked, what didn't, why it's important to struggle now. And the Accord, as a period of kind of banning industrial struggle over wages and conditions, really interrupted that process.
And I suppose too, some of what you were saying earlier about fewer people doing the same amount, if not more work, sometimes that doesn't necessarily leave a lot of time to be active and to sort of work to try and solve the problems of work. So there's a lot happening there. Somebody's asking about how government policies, if there was a greater emphasis on producing things locally, if that would make a difference to union membership and union activity. So I guess, I mean, it's sort of been a campaign for several unions over the years, you know, especially around keeping manufacturing here in Australia. So the examples in the question are, you know, trains and ferries. But I think that's a tough call to try and make.
Well, this is what getting rid of tariffs really was about, right? Like you point to, particularly in manufacturing, those unions have continued to call for, particularly for government, to rely on contracts for goods that are produced in Australia. So particularly in shipbuilding and in you know, submarines, things like this, the unions have called for the government, even just them, to rely on goods produced in Australia. But really, the economic ideology since the mid-70s and early 80s has been towards you know, what we might call free trade, where and no tariffs, where goods are produced at their cheapest point internationally. And that creates a real problem because workers in other countries are paid often a lot less. And you know, it's difficult for Australian companies to compete with those lower wages. Of course, for people like Bert Heinemann, Nick Southall, who are internationalists, their emphasis is always on lifting the wages and conditions of workers everywhere and solidarity between workers, not so much seeing this as a question of jobs for just Australians. And so I guess one answer to that question is how international solidarity through supply chains can improve conditions of workers everywhere, and how that can also help protect workers during periods of economic crisis.
And we probably have time for just sneak in one more question. So somebody's asking about your work with climate change, which was mentioned in the introduction, and you've touched on it a little bit when you were talking about cleaners in Queensland, you know, out there in the middle of the day, quite hot environment. But what else does that look like for you? What are you researching when you're talking about climate change and the world of work?
Obviously, hotter temperatures are already here. And one reason we started this research at the Climate Justice Centre at UTS was because I was interested in how the experiences now of climate change might be a place to build discussion and political capacity around trying to get better policy on climate change overall. Heat stress and extreme weather, I guess the way that we've tried to focus that. When we started this research, it was before the bushfires. And so heat stress really was the cutting edge. More people die of heat stress in Australia than any other form of national disaster. And so it is and particularly construction workers and others are at risk. We couldn't have imagined what happened with the bushfires and the growing capacity to recognise that extreme weather is being caused by climate change. And while there's a lot of focus on what's happening to, say, the natural environment or what's happening in local communities in the hot weather in Western Sydney, there was very little research, I think, at the level of hearing how workers were actually experiencing it in their own words. And so we've done work looking at construction workers and now cleaners, educators, health workers, paramedics. Particularly, we got a lot of responses in the United Workers Union survey from Northern Territory and Queensland, and we're just starting to dig into the analysis of that. And I looked at every response related to COVID and heat stress to look at how that had particularly gotten worse for those workers. It's really rich, but it was incredibly humbling. The discomfort of wearing masks or having to work at home at the moment in a lockdown is insignificant compared to the experiences of those workers who, I should add again, often are very precarious, working in extremely long hours for little wages and little protections. So I think that it's important to remember climate change is not something elsewhere or going to happen in the future. There are workers in Australia today suffering
in that right now. Look, thank you so much for sharing your research with us. I'm sorry that it was delayed, but it was really great to have you here today. Such a terrific response from people here online saying how much they appreciated hearing what you had to say, and also just how dramatic some of this story is and how hard people have fought for rights that sometimes we might take for granted a little bit. So thank you very much. We look forward to more. And also for everyone who's joining us today, don't forget we'll have another Scholar Talk next month. We'll have a little bit of history that's quite different. We'll jump forward a couple of decades and we'll be exploring lesbians in the 1990s in Sydney, and especially their lives through two quite prominent publications, Wicked Women and Lesbians on the Loose. And that is with one of our fellows, of course. Dr. Sophie Robinson will be here sharing her research with us. So that is on Tuesday, the 3rd of August at 11 o'clock. On your library at home. I hope to see you then. Stay safe, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Rachel.